Excellencies, distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to welcome you to the online conference titled The Blue Economy and COVID-19 Pandemic, New Challenges, Recovery Measures, and Resilience, in preparation for the World Oceans Day on the 18th of June. This is also a milestone to the forthcoming United Nations Oceans Conference in Lisbon. As you may be aware, in light of the COVID pandemic, the 2020 United Nations Conference, which was scheduled to take place from the 2nd to the 6th of June in Lisbon, has been postponed per decision 74-548 adopted by the General Assembly, 13th of April. Kenya and Portugal, as co-hosts of the conference, are in consultations with the General Assembly, and we will decide on possible future dates for the conference, including timelines for the preparatory process. The current pandemic we're all enduring has caused disturbance across all sectors of the blue economy. But we should take advantage of this moment to make a sustainable blue recovery. Our work towards achieving a sustainable blue economy must not stop. We need to protect and conserve the oceans and enable humankind to live in harmony with them. As the oceans sustain us, we must find solutions to problems that threaten us all, like the climate crisis or the current COVID-19. Humankind should strive more than ever to protect the ocean and its rich biodiversity. This is why we hope for bold action at the United Nations Ocean Conference in Lisbon to safeguard maritime biodiversity, ecosystems, and resources. Harness scientific knowledge to advance progress towards a sustainable blue economy and across all the Sustainable Development Goals. Our current online event is the consequence of many requests to the organizing partners, UNCTAD, FAO, UNITAR, and IOI. The event is also possible thanks to the kind support of the Organization of East Caribbean States, OECS, and the UN DOALOSH. And I'm very happy that the Portuguese mission could join in this effort. The online event will seek to provide an outlook on the challenges brought by the COVID-19 pandemic and explore opportunities and prospects for recovery and resilience in coastal and island developing countries. The conference would be also a good opportunity to identify action that partners take to adjust the research, technical cooperation, and capacity building trade-related response to the pandemic. I'm very encouraged that more than 800 people registered for this event. Not all will be present, but this number shows a really high level of interest. Please be aware that in the webpage of the event, you will find two analytical notes by UNCTAD. One on the blue economy and the COVID-19 pandemic, and another on COVID-19, a 10-point action plan to strengthen international trade and transport facilitation in times of pandemic. There, you'll also find additional documents placed by partners. Before we start, I will give the floor to the UNITAR technical team to walk us through the use of the Zoom platform so we can have a substantive and interactive session this afternoon. All panelists can use the share screen function to show their PPTs in case they want to use them. Questions and answers by participants can be written in the Q&A function of the Zoom platform anytime. I will now give the floor to Emily Fraser from UNITAR, which will be much more competent than I am in explaining all the technical aspects. Emily, please.
Thank you, Ambassador, and welcome to the World Oceans Day Global Online Conference on the Blue Economy and the COVID-19 pandemic. Personally, I'm Emily Fraser from UNITAR, and I'd like to open by taking the opportunity to thank all partners, including UNCTAD, FAO, the IOI, as well as everybody else who contributed to the organisation of this event. And as the Ambassador said, we've been excellently, enthusiastically, extremely over the moon to receive over 800 participants registering for today's conference. So thank you for joining us. As many of you will already be aware, the Zoom platform is extremely easy and straightforward to navigate. And I'm here, as well as my colleagues at UNITAR, to ensure you have a smooth experience throughout the conference. Given that we're over 500 participants today from across the world, all participants will be muted for the duration of the conference, and the video function will be switched off, except for the panelists. If you have any questions for the panelists, please use the Q&A function, and you'll see on the left of your screen, the Q&A function icon is simply the Q and the A with two speech bubbles. Here you'll be able to type your question, which will be visible to all panelists. Panelists will choose to answer your question either verbally or in writing, at which point your question will become visible to all participants. When posting your question, please identify yourself, and this is very important. Please identify yourself with your name and secondly, your organisation. This will help panelists to answer your question effectively. You will also see the chat room function at the bottom of your screen, looking like the central icon with one speech marker. Here, the discussion will be unmoderated, therefore please proceed with caution when exchanging in this space. And our advice as the organisers is to not click on any links which are posted in this space. Once again, this will be unmoderated. Now will be used during the conference. This is when a panelist may ask the audience to reply to a certain question with multiple choice answers. Your answer will be submitted completely anonymously, but it will help us to ensure the conference is interactive and allow opportunities to engage as a group and as a community. So please feel free to share your opinion. The conference will be recorded, and the recording will be made available online for all those who are unable to join us today. Without any further ado, I join our chair, the Ambassador, and panelists in welcoming you to the conference and wish you a successful and fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Emily. I think this was very useful. And after this introduction, let us begin with the first segment on coastal and marine tourism and impacts on small island development states by Pamela Coke-Hamilton, Director, Division on International Trade and Commodities of UNCTAD, and by Stephen Fevrier, Head of the Permanent Delegation of the Organization of the East Caribbean States. Pamela, welcome. You have the floor now.
Okay, am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, fellow panelists. It's good to see so many people have logged on and are logging on. As you know, this is a critical area for so many of our countries, and on behalf of UNCTAD, FAO, UNITAR, and IOI, I'd like to welcome you all to the timely online conference. As we all know, COVID-19 has posed an unprecedented threat to our lives and livelihoods. In this globalized and interconnected age of global trade, the disruptions to vital industries have been felt acutely throughout the world economy, and the blue economy was no exception. In fact, the blue economy is estimated to account for approximately 3.5 to 7% of global GDP. Blue economic sectors, meaning those largely relying on the marine environment, ecosystems, and species to generate economic value, are being heavily impacted. The largest of all blue economy sectors is coastal and maritime tourism. Before the pandemic, the tourism sector was thriving. The global travel and tourism sector was growing at 3.9% annually and contributed a record 8.8 trillion in GDP and 319 million jobs to the world economy in 2018. About half of all tourists choose a coastal destination for their vacations, conferences, and businesses. And coming from a small island state myself, I can attest to this fact. UNCTAD 15 is supposed to be in Barbados. So we understand very much what the implications are and have been. Tourism is the economic and employment lifeline of many coastal and island countries. Coastal zones such as the Mediterranean and Caribbean basins are suffering heavily from confinement measures as their livelihoods depend on a limited set of marine-based activities. Subsequent temporary suspension of air, rail, and road travel, border closures, confinement measures, coupled with the suspension of most economic activities, including hotels and restaurants, have been the main determinants of the level of impact. And I just want to say as a caveat here that the reopening process that many of our islands are now undertaking have been met with some resistance internally because of the fear of what the impact of newly arriving tourists without being tested will have on the health of the countries, despite the fact, of course, that the economic fallout has been so vicious that they're caught in a catch-22 situation. But I'm sure Stephen will expand on that in his presentation. Now, public health is of paramount importance for human survival and development. In response to the pandemic, measures were introduced by affected countries with different modalities, timescales, and levels to curb the spread of the virus since early this year. Those measures have been unprecedented in nature, resulting in a huge fall in demand for travel, transport, and trade disruptions in both goods, but also in key services sectors such as tourism. The travel and tourism sectors are the most affected blue economic sectors by the pandemic. Recent UNWTO estimates point to a double-digit decrease of 22% in Q1, with arrivals in March down by 57%. This translates into a loss of 67 million international arrivals and about US 80 billion in receipts. Besides these, we're facing restrictions at different levels in all travel destinations worldwide by airport and road. Now we need to understand also that the March figures do not take into account what has been occurring up to June. Thus far, there are now estimates that the tourism arrivals may be down by as much as 78 to 80%, and we can extrapolate what the costs have been from there. The Asia Pacific region, which has 35% decrease in tourist arrival, Europe has 19%, and America's 15%, are also regions that have been affected by the pandemic, in addition to Africa. Drop in tourism receipts has been extraordinarily significant in some of the cities, reaching 16% as a percentage of GDP. This, combined with the slowdown also in remittances, which in some countries constitutes up to 40% in the Pacific, as well as 25% in Haiti, combined to make the situation one that is unprecedented and unbelievable. And therefore, what we want to do is expected that for the tourism-dependent countries, the COVID-19 pandemic has and will continue to directly result in record amounts of revenue loss and foreign exchange. According to the ILO in 2019, the tourism sector accounted for 330 million jobs worldwide and 10.3% of global employment. They warned that there will be a loss between 75 million to 120 million jobs worldwide, which are at risk depending on the scenarios that are taken. If this is the case, we can imagine what the fallout will be for the young, for temporary workers, for people in the informal economy, and also for women who are highly dependent on this as sources of income. So under this complex context, there's a need to devise a global blue recovery and technical support mechanism to temporarily sustain most vulnerable economies and populations, and at the same time allow a reopening of key travel routes to Europe, North America, and Asia under safe conditions. Many tourism-dependent countries would need to prepare for stricter air and cruise travel sanitary requirements to keep tourists safe, as well as their own populations, and allow flows to incrementally increase under close health monitoring. Bilateral technical cooperation will be essential, as travelers, countries, and others may be applying different criteria due to current lack of global and even a regional coordination on the matter. Any recovery mechanism needs to definitely be blue. Over 3 billion people live by the coast, and most of the activities sustaining their livelihoods are heavily and unevenly affected by the pandemic, especially tourism. Recent bankruptcy declarations by some national and regional airlines, car rental and hotel chains, and thousands of small businesses are clear evidence of this. A blue recovery should be guided by SDG 14 implementation, and more particularly Target 7, which states, by 2030, increase the economic benefits to SIDS and LDCs, but also to all developing countries, from the sustainable use of marine resources, including through sustainable management of fisheries, aquaculture, and tourism. Mr. Chairman, we must seize every opportunity to facilitate recovery and boost resilience for the future. This moment calls for intentional and targeted action to ensure that we do not come out on the other side of COVID-19 worse off than before. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Pamela. I think you gave us some very sobering numbers and a really good portrait of the challenges that we face. I now pass the floor to Stephen Fevrier. Stephen?
Thank you very much, Ambassador, and thank you very much to colleagues for the opportunity to present to you today on this very important issue for, particularly for small economies. Today, I will go through some of the observed impacts of the crisis on small economies, particularly SIDS, as well as with specific emphasis on the tourism sector, which of course is vital to the economic viability and the social protections which are essential to our countries. Finally, I will have an opportunity to share some of my own impressions of how the region could use this opportunity to re-establish and reposition its sector in a way which would provide for a sustainable future. So SIDS, like most of the OECS, open economies and are very susceptible to external shocks. Of course, the COVID-19 pandemic has once again exposed those vulnerabilities. The crisis poses what I think Pam also referred to as an unmatched and in some senses unprecedented threat to the economic viability of SIDS. As well as to the ability of our member states to provide the required social protections, which are more important now than ever before. So the openness of our economies to international trade has quickly allowed for a feed-through of those dramatic economic impacts. First, to the vital tourism sector, which would have then transmitted those impacts and shocks to other allied sectors such as the agriculture and of course the manufacturing sector. So it's important to note that our exposure and to assess the impact of our exposure to the global economy, it's important to reflect on what has taken place since the advent or early January. So to assess that exposure of the health and economic crisis, it is important that we note that the WTO has forecast the contraction of global merchandise trade in 2020 to 32% contraction and a 35% contraction in demand for services. And of course, we are heavily service-dependent economies. The IMF has suggested that should those outcomes be realized, there would be a contraction of global output by about 3%. So what does this mean for the OECS and SIDS generally? The overall impact on the economies of the smallest and most vulnerable amongst us would be severe. For example, in the OECS, 2020 will prove to be one of the most challenging fiscal years on record, with contractions expected to range from minus 4.2% in St. Vincent and the Grenadines to over 10% in Antigua and Barbuda. But let's be cautious here. Those are preliminary impacts, and the central bank, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, has indicated that those forecasts would likely have to be revised downward, with some countries realizing 20% contractions in their output. This is going to also further be exacerbated by the impact of a reduction in inflows of capital from traditional sources, including the remittances, particularly from the US and the UK, as well as FDI inflows and ODA, which will see significant contractions. This will also have a knock-on effect and further complicate policy choices of central government, as well as the ability of those governments to respond to some of the social impacts which are now being realized. While the region region and specific sector data may not be available at the moment, the UNWTO has predicted 30% contraction and decline in tourism receipts, which would amount to close to $500 billion in lost earnings. This is striking because it will also affect negatively over 390 million jobs which may be lost. And that would amount to 1 in 10 workers globally. For the Caribbean, whilst the entire sector has been shuttered, the Caribbean is, for that reason, most likely to be one of the worst affected regions in the world, given that of the 20 top tourism-dependent countries globally, the Caribbean accounts for 10 of those top 20 countries globally. Take, for example, St. Lucia, where 42% of the workforce depends either directly or indirectly on tourism receipts. And across the OECS member states, 46% of all employment generated comes specifically from the tourism sector. So beyond the actual stayover sector, which is heavily impacted, it is important to note that the accommodation sector has been completely shuttered. So every hotel has been closed except for purposes of quarantine facilities. But beyond the quarantine facilities and the shuttering of those accommodation sector, it is important to note that marine, cruise, and yachting subsectors have been heavily and severely impacted. As of April, as the graph would show, over 60% of all cruise vessels have been riding anchor. So the sector has really ground to a halt. And similarly, the yachting subsector has been closed. And of course, there will be lost receipts from tours, ancillary services, as well as the provisioning of both yachts as well as cruise vessels. And not to mention the reduction in government tax take. To fully and further illustrate this point, over 46% of the employment in the OECS is generated through the tourism sector, either directly or indirectly. And that amounts to a contribution of between 37 and 70% of GDP. Now, since the sector has closed in March, one example which is particularly striking is the government of St. Lucia estimated prior to the crisis that the April revenue would yield over $120 million. The actual realized outturn was about $50 million. So actual government receipts have fallen significantly and will continue to fall unless certain actions are taken to restore confidence in the sector. So what have been the observed impacts? As I indicated, the tourism sector has been completely closed. That has resulted as a knock-on effect, the closure of the manufacturing sector with few exceptions, as well as the closure of the limited production in the agricultural sector. The social sectors have also been impacted, the health sector as well as the educational sector, due to the impacts of the crisis. So I'd like to share with you some potential, let's say, strategic opportunities that we may have. All is not lost. And the crisis does present an opportunity for a strategic refocusing or repurposing of the sector to ensure that it becomes more sustainable. So I'd like to share with you, one, some of the national activities or actions which could be taken to make the sector more sustainable. And then we could look at what are the multilateral responses which could assist. Firstly, at the national level, we can use this opportunity to mainstream sustainability into tourism planning and tourism policy across the board. We should also consider what force multipliers, for example, technology, can be used to, one, improve efficiencies, two, reduce frictions, particularly in the COVID environment, and reduce the level of contact between persons in the sector. So force multipliers are important. Of course, there is a need to improve the value-added content, and we need to really refocus on how that could be achieved to ensure that there's a higher remunerative return for the sector and for the workers in the sector without adversely affecting the ecology and the sustainability of the sector. This would further require some process re-engineering within the sector, which can and should be looked at. And finally, we need to look at the opportunities through trade policy to see how we could energize certain elements of the tourism value chain to achieve those outcomes. From a multilateral standpoint, there is a need to ensure that the WTO and international agencies are more responsive to those needs, that concessionary finance is available for the retooling of the sector to make it more sustainable, and that donors and development partners must be more sensitive to and enhance their development cooperation in a way which would provide for more sustainable solutions. So in sum, there are two of few last words I would like to share. One, the OECS, like all SIDS, is at a critical inflection point given the susceptibility to natural and exogenous shocks. The crisis, of course, has exposed further the economic and social vulnerability, but there are some steps we can take in the meantime until tourism is fully restored. One, we need to look at stimulating interregional tourism, but also and critically, we need to look at mainstreaming sustainability into our tourism blueprint. We need to look at solutions such as Blue Biotrade, which is an initiative which PAM's division and the OECS is currently working on. We need to look at ecotourism as well as heritage tourism, very low impact, high value sectors, which can provide some additional sustainability to the sector without unduly putting pressures on underlying ecosystems. Finally, we must establish a link between tourism and restoration services, and such as responsible fisheries and the use of marine protected areas as a driver of tourism, but also sustainability in our key maritime sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And I will now, we now have two panelists who will address the topics of COVID-19, global market trends of fish and fish products. First is Odom Lem, Deputy Director, Fisheries and Aquaculture of FIA from FAO. Odin, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. Do you have my screen on? I'm trying to share it.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for organizing this very important event. I will talk about the impact on fisheries, but talking to you from Rome, which is also one of the principal cities and destinations of tourism, I can also report that the impact on the industry in Rome and in Italy is also dramatic. But that's not the topic of my talk. I will talk about the impact on the market and the situation in the fishery sector, including aquaculture, of course. It's not moving.
Yeah.
Organizers, can you please move the next slide, please?
Okay.
What you need, Album, we can see on the screen.
Okay. Yeah. First of all, it's not easy to make projections based on the information we have, which is very dramatic. But we have to look forward. I will show and share with you some of the most important impacts that we have found. This is being, of course, continuously updated by new information from different countries, different regions, because the impact is hitting very differently, region and subsector and subsector, with huge difference between regions and between countries. Next slide, please. First of all, let us remind you that the fishery sector is very complex. It's fragmented. The value chains and supply chain in the sector are very long. For example, the origin of the product may vary from capture fisheries, from aquaculture, and also you have production areas in the marine environment, in brackish water, and inland. So where it comes from also has different impacts on the output. There are different types of producers, ranging from large-scale producers or industrial producers, small-scale producers, and also artisanal or small-scale producers. And of course, the diversity of species that we catch or that we farm in aquaculture is enormous. In fact, there are more than 1,000 species that are produced or farmed or caught that enter international markets. So the impact is also very different to some extent, depending on what kind of product we're talking about, the species, the nature of the operations, and whether it's caught or whether it's farmed, and where it's farmed. Next, please. So the impact is dramatic, as I said, and it impacts both the supply side, on the production side, on the demand side, the transportations, linking demand and supply, processing, of course, and also how this impacts international trade and how international trade is impacted by all these factors. Next, please. Next, please. So I will show you a little bit how or why this is impacted so much. This slide from Rabobank shows international flows in seafood products and fish and fishery products. And you can see that the trade flows, the supply flows of product is just impressive and incredible from all regions, importing and exporting. All countries are involved in this. You see that, for example, China is a very large exporter, but also a very large importer. Same for the United States, very large exporters and very large importers. So you have flows of product for all sorts of very good reasons flowing around the world, making the value chains of the supply chain, of course, very sophisticated, but also very fragmented and very fragile and exposed in a situation like we are facing today. Next, please. And in fact, when you compare the fishery sector to other sectors, we see that the importance of trade is much higher than for other food or animal protein sectors. In fact, the importance of trade or the value of exports of fish and fishery products is exactly the total of the exports of beef, pork, and poultry. And that shows again how important it is that trade flows continue to flow as free as possible. Next, please. So what are the effects of production and supply? Well, taking into account that almost half of what we produce comes from agriculture, a little bit more than 50% comes from capture fisheries, which is what we produce, but not what we consume as human beings. In fact, as human beings, for human consumption, agriculture is a little bit more important. We have producers of agriculture and capture fisheries, which are very, very diverse. We see here the role of China, the role of India, Indonesia, but also South America, Peru, Chile, but Vietnam, we have Bangladesh, Russia. We have a number of very large and important players in this field. Next, please. So what are the effects then on the first hand on production? And I've divided it into capture fisheries and aquaculture. Well, some of the effects are the same. The effects that concern international demand, of course, has been reduced. It has been reduced especially because of one sector, and that is the food service. Hotels, restaurants, canteen, that in many areas of the world closed down or at least limited tremendously their demand. And this, of course, has a large impact on production and supply as well. On the capture fishery side, we have problems on ensuring that the distance on board the fishing vessels, of course, is respected, and therefore the safety of the crews. We have a problem of moving the crews, or changing the crews in the ports, for example, getting the crews there and getting the old crews that are getting off back to their home countries. The closure of ports in many areas of the world, or at least limitation. The difficulty to some extent to ensure that the vessels get supplies, which was very difficult a little bit in the beginning of the pandemic, and also the very large impact on coastal fisheries and the small-scale fishery sector, which are very often the most vulnerable and most exposed persons in the world that rely relatively more for their livelihoods on fish and fishery products, that the trade is going, that the flows are going, that the demand is taking their production. On the aquaculture side, of course, the demand and the food service demand have impacted in the same way. But there is also the movement of people getting to the farms, which also presented some difficulties in the beginning. The fact that you have to ensure, of course, the safety of those who work there. And cost of maintenance, of course, has increased. It's become more difficult. For example, especially divers to visit faraway farms is much more difficult. And also, to some extent, the challenge of ensuring seed and feed. If we go further from the production side, going to processing, of course, there has been a reduction of raw material. Again, the difficulty of getting all the workers on site and operate safely has been difficult. Distribution issues, getting into the transportation chain, and to ensure that the companies will continue to operate and have liquidity to operate. When it concerns markets, I mentioned already that food service, hotels, restaurants, canteens, of course, many areas of the world have closed down. There has been, though, an increase in demand for long-time shelf products such as canned products and frozen products. There is the difficulty of timely transportation. We also must remember that some fresh fish are transported by air, and with shutting down of many of the airlines of the world, also the opportunities or the possibility of moving cargo by air has been totally eliminated for many markets. There are increasing border restrictions, and again, also the access to credit is very difficult for many of the operators in the distribution chain. But also there is the impact on fisheries governance. to ensure that science continues, the management and stock assessment continues, and also that enforcement and surveillance continues. For example, you may know that on many fishing vessels you have observers, and it's not possible to get now the new observers to get to the ports and get onto the boat and to the boat and get the old observers that were getting off duty to get home to their home country. So that has been difficulty as well. There is no sign that IUU fishing in itself has increased. We have a number of new tools, the PSMA, electronic surveillance, satellites, etc. But of course, if this situation is to remain for quite some time, there is, of course, the danger that IUU fishing will bounce back in some areas of the world. So it's our joint responsibility to make sure that that does not happen. Next, please. Some overall effects that have been mentioned already on GDP. There has been an increase in fish loss and waste in some instances, reduced food securities because of how this has impacted livelihoods. Nutrition is impacted because if people eat less fish, their nutritional values is endangered or at least worsened. A very large impact on developing countries that are much reliant on exports of fish and fishery products, but there are also new market opportunities. We see that the take-up of digitalization of electronic platforms and auctions and distribution really has taken off, and this has also provided new opportunities for operators. So in the misfortune, there is also some opportunities. Next, please. Next slide, please. Yes, so I mentioned already the issue of value and volume going down. It has also forced many operators to focus more on the domestic market and adjacent or regional markets. There are new shopping habits from consumers, more electronic, more domestic, or more of supplies closer by. There's very large acceleration of digitalization of the sector, both in aquaculture and in capture fisheries, but more than anywhere else in distribution and sales. And also some restructuring already we've seen of companies. Next, please. So again, I will refer to what can be done to ensure that the impact is reduced as much as possible. First of all, to keep trade flows open. And there are joint initiative by FAO, WTO, and WHO to this effect. There is also a lot of information in FAO and other bodies, and including GLOBEFISH, on markets and commodities and trade-related information on what has happened in world markets and what we think will also be the situation in the next quarter. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. I think we're seeing the results of the poll. Interesting. Right. Very good. So now we have the second speaker on this panel, which is David Vivas Egui, Legal Officer, Trade and Environment Branch, Office of the Director, Division on International Trade and Commodities of UNCTAD. David, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to share a screen. 1 second to have the presentation. For some seconds, you will see it in a few seconds. Yes. Can everybody see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. It's always great to speak after Audum. It makes things easier for us to come into specifics. I'm going to be talking about global market trends and focusing on fish and fish products, especially from the harvest side more than from the aquaculture side. Perhaps sometimes images are better than a lot of explanation. You can see at the screen tons, there are dozens and dozens of reports from different sources, newspaper, academic journals, private sector reports, etc., showing the huge impacts of the COVID pandemic measures on the fishery sector. In terms of exports, reports countries go to drop from 5% to 30% over the first quarter of 2020, which is a lot. Yeah, overall, the year, depending on how measures evolve and how they are applied, exports may be dropping from 15 to 30% at the end of the year. We don't know yet, it's too early to say, but the impact in the first quarter is very high. Also having huge impacts on the production when having closure of fisheries, or even in exports because they have not air travel. So these are just some of the images all over the world. Now, if we go to data, the image is partial because we don't have the data entire for the entire quarter. The best source at this stage is GLOBEFISH, also from FAO. And here I'm just showing an example of what can be seen, which is very partial if you want to have hard data. Which is that here I'm comparing the exports of Thailand on all tuna export, big tuna exporter. I'm here also having Ecuador, also a big tuna exporter. And here if we compare the exports of all tuna products in January 2018, 19, compared to 2020, in almost all the cases in 2020, it's coming down. And this is just the month of January where the problem was starting to be realized globally. Mm-hmm. We will look at February, March, April, the drops will be more significant. And again, depends on the countries. I have seen reports, again, for example, from Ecuador saying that the entire quarter, the drops of export was 8% overall, and other countries like Argentina going from 15 to 30%, not in tuna, but other species. So we will be having hard data in one more trimester, but the outlook doesn't look very optimistic. Within the fishery sector, taking into account that the fishery sector in many cases continue to work, and I will clarify that in a second. And here you can see the main impacts in trends in terms of the demand side and the supply side. In the demand side, we have a falling consumer demand, having closure of restaurants, hotels, retail businesses, and many of these businesses offer fresh product. So there have been a drop in the fresh product consumption due to the different retailers and business involved, but also at the household level. There have been changes in consumer demand. Many people are eating more locally, especially due to the impacts on transport, but also they have taken increased consumption of processed fish because it can be a stockpile, can keep for longer, and the confinement has lasted in some cases up to 90 days. So many people was stockpiling food, and preparations in can, in pouch, and in other forms were preferred by the consumers. There have been changes in the niche of portions and sales. E-purchases and e-auctions have become more active. E-auctions have been an interesting alternative for small-scale fishers and for certain organized fishers in a way to at least reach whatever market is possible through the internet by presenting different prices. There have been, this is not yet evidence, but there have been concerns. This is a concern about increased and stricter application of sanitary measures. So have been notified to the WTO in terms of wildlife restrictions on wildlife trade. But it has been evidenced by recent academic research that the COVID-19 has not made it into the aquatic species. So the fish species and other marine species are not vectors of transmission, while some mammals were identified as potential vectors for transmission, namely bat, pangolin, etc. On the supply side, one important factor has been the possibility of fishing for the closure measures. In some countries, no fishing has taken place. In some countries, has continued as the spread of the disease has not yet arrived. The spread of the disease has come like a wave. We're in the oceans economy, starting from China, Europe, the Americas, now coming to Africa. So the measure has been taken at different times, in different formats, and having different impacts. In some cases, the wave, by arriving late, for example, to the Americas, has allowed that in some countries, they could fish the first 3 months, while in Asia, the impact was further before. Many fishers and industrial fleets are missing profitable fishing seasons, because sometimes you can only fish at a certain time of the year, could be the beginning or later. For those who had the fishing season at the beginning of the year, the impact was higher. There have been problems of disrupted trade routes. Air transport has been a very significant one. For many countries like the Maldives, they have not been able to put the consignments of tuna in many cases because there are no flights. So for those who use air transport, the impact was higher than those who directly deliver at port. An important aspect that has been mentioned by Association of Seafarers and many stakeholders is the lack of sanitary protections. There were no measures, no material to protect the fishers while fishing, and lack of social protection, social security, life insurance, services for the family while the fisher was at port, or while staying at port have a different source of income. So the social protection came very strongly in one of the trends, and the efforts like FAO on social guidelines on value chains may be very important in the future. There have been also an interesting point, lack of capacity to process for those countries that mainly capture fresh fish and export. Examples have been in Chile, where there was more salmon being stocked, fresh salmon that could be processed. So that meant prices dropping and difficulties in exporting or selling it internally or externally. So this is an important process aspect, and I will explain in one of the recommendations, because countries that had higher processing capacity internally were more resilient to the impact in captured fisheries than others. Here, then, okay, we have seen a lot of the problems, so we cannot get apocalyptic. What can we do? How are we coping with this challenge? And I have presented just an illustrative list of possible measures. There may be many more. Some of them are developing in brief, already produced by UNCTAD. And I'm following a value chain approach. So this is the first, the lower part of the value chain, harvesting and processing. We will talk about commercialization and recovery. On harvesting, I think an important point is that during the pandemic, we need to understand that fish remains an essential food. It's an essential animal protein with very low environmental footprint. Many of the actors in the fisheries value chain continue working, continue producing, continue selling, if not exporting to the local market, in many cases, not in all cases. So it depends again on the measures taken in each country. But it was considered essential good, as all the agricultural products. They have been problems, but it has been at least continuing. It has not been as strong as in tourism, that some hotels has closed completely in many countries or in the entire country. Another aspect is that, as mentioned, we don't have evidence that there have been an increase in IUU fishing. There have been cases, especially due to lack of or weakened monitoring by governments during the confinement period. But we need to keep the fight. We cannot reduce, and we need to rely more on monitoring, control, and surveilling electronic systems and cooperation through contact. In some cases, due to the fact that the main impacts were felt during the beginning of the year, there may be a need to adjust fishing season. Obviously, we saw that if below MSY, not affecting stocks, not disturbing reproduction periods. But during 2020 and 2021, countries may need to think on case-by-case basis how to adjust the fishing periods in a way that fishers can compensate for lack of activity during a certain period. But again, under certain sustainability conditions, if not, wouldn't work. On processing, well, I guess we need to introduce sanitary and social safety readiness and adaptation plans in the fisheries, seafood, and aquaculture sectors. Many of these workers are very vulnerable because they are at sea, they are unprotected, they have very weak contracts, they have no social security. So this is an important lesson from this. The social network was not strong enough, and in some cases inexistent. In processing, there have been interesting shift of fresh production to shift in seafood processing. Why? Because if you process, you can stockpile, you can stock and sell for later and for a longer period. Fresh needs to go and reach the market sooner. So again, those countries that have some processing capacity could use any excedent of fish to be processed, to be canned, to be poached, to be transformed in different formats to be sold later, or be directed to the internal market who was in demand for food products. Another action that could be taken is enhance digitalization and coordination, especially through the value chain, through producers, suppliers, transport, warehousing, logistical services, especially to avoid food losses and waste. Now, on the upper part of the value chain, commercialization, the important thing at this stage is that we keep a balance between having effective sanitary measures and avoid trade restrictive measures and on-call protectionism. We need to minimize unnecessary controls on border. We're talking about perishable goods. We need to fast track. We need to maintain all the trade facilitation gains we have. We need to make effective use, and this could be a very interesting way out for small case fisheries, for small fishers associations, for responsible fishers associations to use more online sales and auction platforms to sell as soon as possible and get the best price possible during these difficult times and also in the recovery phase. Now, when looking at recovery, I think this is a very important point because let's hope we don't have a rebound. And even if we have a rebound after the virus has been absorbed or we find a vaccine, we will need to recover soon from these impacts. The first is that any rescue package do not only need to look at green issues, which has been very mentioned in Europe, for example, but also it needs to be blue, focus on sustainability and vulnerable populations. These are two key aspects of sustainable development. We need to, again, key recommendation mentioned by all the partners involved, we need to phase out unsustainable expenditure, including fish subsidies, and shift the resources. This is the best time. Why to invest in more capacity enhancing subsidies, harmful subsidies, when you need to support fishers and sustainability? It doesn't make any sense. It's the right time to do the changes, and we hope the WTO can do it soon. Finally, we need to enhance international cooperation. Multilateralism is more important than ever, and all UN agencies are starting to work together. One UN, this is an example, this event, we have a plan of action with FAO and UNEP to fast track the implementation of SDG, and we cannot go into small country activities. We need to think broadly, multilaterally, regionally, to get out of these difficult times together. Finally, UNCTAD has prepared a page with all the resources on trade and COVID-19 impact in all areas, trade, investment, e-commerce, etc. And they're all available in one single page. So for all users, they can find them. Here you have on blue economy, science and technology, investment. There are many more. So I highly recommend participants to look at it because they might find many interesting information and data in this special time. Thank you very much for your time. I'm ready to respond.
Thank you very much, David. I think now we will take a short break, a 5-minute break, where we will gather some of the questions that have been put to the participants. You know that on the questions, it won't be possible to address them all, so some of your questions can be addressed via the chat. So we now have a 5-minute break. I'll see you in 5 minutes. Okay. I think I'm ready. So, shall I start reading the questions? Okay, David. So we have first a question from Reina Sotillo from Argentina, which it is a very long question, so I will have to summarize it. It touches several aspects. One is, what is the recommendation in order to overcome the effects of COVID-19, particularly in the reality marked by vulnerable fishermen and fish farmers in developing countries, and particularly as there's competition that continues to grow. It also touches on the conditions of work of the workers that do not have the full benefit of the standards imposed by the ILO on the Convention 188. And the final point is about the capacity of vessels with capacities with fuel subsidies, and that they do not treat waste as they should, and they throw away discarded species. It's a not very full summarize, but I think Odom and David will be able to address in more detail the question. Maybe I can start with Odom.
Well, thank you, Chair. I'm a little bit hesitant because the questions were so many and the text was so long, and it really included a number of issues ranging from subsidies and Convention 188 of ILO and many other issues. But in general, I can say that the impact has been very large by the pandemic, both on the supply side and the demand side. Mrs. Sotillo did well in pointing to the ILO Convention 188, which deals with the safety on board of the fishing crews, fishing vessel crews, and that is of course a very important topic. And one of the reasons why also fishing activity has come down has been the difficulty, not only because of the market, but also the difficulty in ensuring the safety of those who are employed on board. And the safety issue is not only a concern of safety on board, it's also a concern for other areas of the value chain, including in processing and the auction facilities, the ports, etc. So certainly this has added not only to cost, but also certainly limited also the amount of operations in order to, and rightly so, ensure the safety of those who are working in the sector. When it relates to subsidies, well, the subsidy discussion is a separate discussion, but certainly in the recovery of the sector, we have to pay more attention to the fact that the sector in the future must be more sustainable in all ways. And that also means that subsidies must be reduced, and especially those subsidies that go to increase capacity of the fishing vessels. So we want to modernize the fleet, but it shouldn't be necessarily done through subsidies, because modernization very often means bigger boats, more efficient boats, and therefore also a higher capacity to fish. Just to close, on Monday we will launch the FAO State of World Fisheries and Aquaculture, which is our major publication in fisheries and aquaculture, and that publication brings a number of messages, and one message is the importance of effective fisheries management. If you don't have effective fisheries management, you will have problems also in sustainability. If you have effective fisheries management, you will have a number of benefits, not only regarding the safety of those who work on board or in the sector, but you will the safety of the stocks, recovery of stocks. But if you don't have that in place, you will have problems as long as you have subsidies and you have other impacts that increase capacity and fishing effort. So recovering the sector in a more sustainable way, in a more blue way, as also David mentioned, is fundamental to its future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. David, do you want to add something?
Very quickly on 3 points mentioned by Mrs. Sotillo. The first is that Convention 188 of the ILO, essential to increase ratification. Less than 20 members worldwide has ratified. I'm not saying implementing. So that shows the level of commitment of the international community. We need to increase that. We need to have a higher effort there. On CITES, a huge number of ratifications, but usually the problem is implementation, monitoring, and capacity to monitor, essential to avoid poaching of wildlife, marine wildlife. And finally, on subsidies, essential that the WTO members find a solution to the subsidies, harmful subsidies question is SDG 14.6. There is no better time. We don't have more money. And if we're gonna use the money that is left, let's do it on sustainability. Super underline. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, David. I will now read another question from Juan Nascimento Cooley, LLP, and this will be addressed to Pamela. And it is, what are the possibilities of developing alternative blue economy sectors in countries which are heavily dependent on tourism, shipping, and fisheries? And which are the most salient sectors to look at? Pamela?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I think there are a couple of areas that, in respect to the blue economy, and I know that Stephen can talk more about this particularly because of the OECS project that we're doing with UNCTAD and the OECS, as well as work we've done in Belize and Costa Rica. Mm-hmm. Several of the areas that need to be looked at in terms of the expansion of the blue economy include not just fisheries, but also looking at alternative methodologies for engaging with the blue economy. For example, have we looked at other types of tourism which are just not sun, sea, and sand? How do we look at areas of medical tourism that utilize the blue economy and for example, the IP that comes out of the various aspects of the blue economy that we can marshal to utilize for alternative medicines, for looking at, for example, teas, etc. We need to look at the blue economy other than just the sea. I think that is the fundamental problem. We need to begin to look at the blue economy as actually an economic engagement, and not just fisheries either. We need to also look at the issue of looking at sports. How have sports been engaged with respect to the blue economy across the region, across the hemisphere? Additionally, one thing that has occurred to me, but I don't know legally whether it could work, was using the law of the sea and the designation of an archipelago from as low as Trinidad, Guyana, all the way up to the Bahamas, and declaring it a single economic space. And what would that mean? And I think if Ani can speak to that, that would be great. But what would be the implications of that in terms of the amount of power that the Caribbean region could execute and have if that were to occur? And is it possible under the law of the sea for us to look at that? Because I think that that would also change in very real terms the benchmark that we're looking at in terms of marshalling the resources of the blue economy. So just my initial thoughts.
Thank you very much, Pamela. As the next questions will be addressed to Stephen and to Odum, maybe some of the ideas that Pamela put to you could also be addressed by you. So the next question, which is addressed to Stephen, from Kumar Hamid and Ashok Pandey, it is, which strategies will you recommend for the tourism industry to overcome the recession during and post COVID-19? And what suggestions do you have for cruise line companies to get back to business after COVID-19 downsizes and all that, in order to kickstart the blue economy, since they are a critical component in sustaining tourism in the OECS? So this is to you, Stephen.
Thank you very much, Chair, for the very rich questions. If I may be permitted, I will just quickly add to Pam's earlier intervention that there are opportunities, particularly through Blue Biotrade, which is a project and a approach to empowering and developing certain blue product lines which are sustainable, which UNCTAD has been a leader in that area. The OECS is currently working with UNCTAD to unlock potential in two sectors, one related to algae, which would be sea moss and sargassum, which is an invasive species, as you would know. So how do we use those algae to produce products which could be sustainable, but also, at least in the case of sargassum, could treat with and address a invasive species which may not be positive for the tourism sector. The other area which we are looking at is a mollusk, which would be conch. How can we use conch sustainably to enhance livelihoods and produce a higher economic return for harvesters and the sector? So to the other questions which you posed, the strategies for tourism, I think one of the critical matters which would need to be addressed is end-to-end protocols for tourism. And those end-to-end protocols are being developed at the moment in certain Caribbean countries with both policymakers from the tourism sector as well as the health CARFA, which is a Caribbean Regional Health, forgot the name of the acronym, but CARFA. Protocols would ensure that tourism could start to re-emerge once those protocols are put in place, and that the traveling public would have to, of course, adhere to those strict protocols. And I say end-to-end because that would require protocols for air transportation, what would be required for contact at the airport with customs as well as the immigration, your contact with ground transportation, contact with the hotel, contact with tours and other attractions. So there must be an end-to-end sanitary approach to the re-engagement of the sector. From an economic standpoint, of course, initially I suspect heavy discounting would be required. But even with heavy discounted, ultimately, if there are not, there's no vaccine or therapeutics which could address some of the concerns related to COVID-19, it may prove difficult to generate sufficient interest to really allow the sector to rebound sufficiently to address the economic needs of the region. And finally, I think this very same is true for the cruise sector, which is also had a very difficult time and is seen as an incubator really of COVID-19, given the some of the, let's say, events which have taken place. That perception, of course, is not founded, and the cruise sector remains very safe. So I think public awareness would need to be worked on, as well as discounting. And similar to the ground and the accommodation sector, there would need to be a very strong protocol, end-to-end protocols established for the sector to breathe confidence back into the sector and allow the sector to hopefully return in a meaningful way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephen. I now have another question, which is addressed to Odom, and it's from Vladimir Kalinsky and Hafida Famiazari. Is there any data on possible impact of COVID-19 on illegal activities on the seas, in particular IUU fishing? Is there any evidence of any reduction or increasing activities? I'll just try to squeeze in another question after this one, and then I would also want to remind our panelists that if they want, they can answer bilaterally, because we have so many questions, it's impossible to take them. They can answer bilaterally through the chat. But now I give the floor to Odom for this question. Alden, please.
Thank you, Chair. On the IUU fishing, whether it has been reduced or not, it is too early. We have anecdotal evidence, but I cannot say we have evidence to that effect. What we know, though, is that fishing activities have been reduced in many areas of the world. So that in itself could mean that IUU fishing in the absolute sense, in absolute numbers, also has been reduced. But it's too early to say. We have some anecdotal evidence that goes both ways, but also in normal times you have IUU fishing going on, but we cannot say that there is more IUU fishing going on now. But if IUU fishing as a percentage of legal fishing is stable, then also with reduced capture fisheries activities, and also IUU fishing has gone down. But it's too early to present any hard evidence on that. Let me say, though, Mr. Chair, that on Saturday we celebrate the International Day for the fight against IUU fishing. So this is a very timely question. And in fact, tomorrow at FAO at 16:30, we have a special event dealing with IUU fishing more in detail. So I invite you all to take part in that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I think we have just time to squeeze in a question addressed to Jan Hoffman, which was not part of our panel yet. But if he would want to answer it now, it will be fine, or else he can answer at the end. But the question is from Yasir K. And the question is, could you please elaborate on zero emission waterborne transport targets of achieving zero emission by 2050? How will the industry catch up with the delay? So, Jan, if you want to answer now, you could answer now. If not, we can keep this question, and at the end of the next stretch, you can answer it.
No, if okay, I will try to answer it. No, I hadn't really prepared for this because the question, the presentation I was asked to make was really more on the trade station part, on the shipping part, on the trade efficiency part. But the zero emissions in shipping is something very close to our heart. We collaborate very closely there with the International Maritime Organization. We have projects with universities, with the World Bank. Overall, it is true, the implicit assumption in this question is that there is an ambition, but we are not yet sure how we should get there, how we could get there. There are short-term tools about speed, about port call optimization, about more cleaning of ships. The question is, how do we incentive the industry to get there? And I mean, I could go on and go on. Sorry, it's a very amazing question. But maybe 2 points to highlight. A lot of the investment that is needed to get to zero emission shipping is actually required ashore, like into energy generation, energy transit, like getting the new fuel to the ships. So out of $1.3 trillion, that's the number that was mentioned, the largest part is investment that's needed on the land side. On the sea side, I personally feel quite strongly about getting the incentives right. Just yesterday, there was a news item, a poll among ship owners. Although everybody is sincerely committed, there's a lot of good ship owners, good maritime administrations, but if it costs more to reduce emissions than not to reduce, why would I do it if the competition doesn't do it? So I personally believe quite strongly in market-based mechanisms. I personally think some type of contribution levy feel, maybe also a trading scheme. There are studies, quite a few studies that suggest that a levy type is more effective. It's better to plan. That's what we would call internalization of externalities. So I think if we really want to achieve this declared objective of getting to zero at some point in time, somebody will have to bite the bullet, but somebody has to pay already today. And if I may just highlight this, I think it's in line with our conference here. Who is paying today for the climate change? people in Bangladesh who get flooded are paying. People in the Caribbean who are affected by hurricanes pay. People in Mali who have dry harvests pay. Rich Swiss ski resorts are paying. So somebody is already paying. And I think if we really need to get there, and there is between 2.2–3% of emissions come from shipping, and if this one is also to be reduced and get to zero, I believe we need some market-based mechanism to have the incentive. I wasn't prepared for that question, but I hope I managed to give the answer, or one possible answer. But happy to engage bilaterally. My email will be on the PowerPoint in a minute, so happy to continue this discussion. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much, Ian. And now we're really going to the second part of our seminar. We're a little behind schedule, but precisely I invite you, Jan, Chief Trade Logistics Branch, DTL, UNCTAD, to present UNCTAD's 10-point plan for maritime transport and trade logistics under COVID. You have the floor, Jan.
Good, thank you very much. Then let me move straight ahead to this green share screen button and hope that it works as we practiced about 10 times just before. So I click here on this presentation, and I hope that all of you now see something that says shipping in times of COVID-19. Shipping in the context of the pandemic, you can look at two types of effect. On the one hand, shipping is affected by the crisis. I will share a couple of slides on the downturn in different shipping segments. But then, of course, shipping is also necessary. Efficient shipping is necessary to overcome the crisis. So let me start with a couple of slides on how shipping is affected by the crisis. We have very recently received data from AIS transmission. This is here with marine traffic, some selected segments. You see how the major segments compared to last year, like beginning of 2019 and now 2020. So it is going down, especially the blue line, energy. You saw the fuel price, oil price went to almost negative in some cases. So ships are being used as a storage space and no longer have port calls. They no longer go to the ports. The one most affected is passengers, so cruise, ferries, and so on. And that again shows the whole challenge for logistics in this COVID crisis is the people, it's the transport workers. It's not so much the cargo, but because cargo comes with seafarers and so on. So this is an important message. The same data can also be shown on a map and even a moving map. So let me see if this 40 seconds video works. You should be seeing now a moving map. This one you could look at probably 5 or 6 times and look at your country, we have the same for different market segments. This one here is an oil tankers. So you see the size of the bullet is how important the country is in terms of port calls. So you see obviously big energy providers, Singapore is a transshipment hub, users, providers. And then the color, the red color means it is getting worse compared to last year, and green is getting more compared to last year. And the last here is the 18th week of the year. You see China has already rebounded. China is back to green and many others are still in the red. So shipping, now I should move to the next one, yes. So I did a little poll to get the wisdom of the crowds on my Twitter account. And there was 1/4 of people who said the main challenge of the GDP trade issue is on the demand side, it's logistics problems. So here, let's have a look at our 10-point action plan. Shipping, efficient trade logistics is necessary to overcome the crisis. This comes from our 10-point action plan, a policy brief, which we published in the 6th United Nations language. The link is on the PowerPoint. So here's a link, and we go basically from left to right here along the supply chain. We start with a ship, move to the port, leave the port, cross the country, cross the border, go to the landlocked country. So first point, uninterrupted shipping. Seafarers are critical personnel for whom teleworking is not possible. Governments need to allow the crews board their ships and be repatriated from any seaport in the world. And if there's one of the 10 points I personally feel actually quite strongly about, is this point of the seafarers. Today, again, there was a call from the trade unions there. At this moment, 150,000 seafarers stuck on their ships, and they really need to get special treatment with visa, with the ports need to help, the dock workers have to allow them to leave the ship and say, oh, I don't want to be contaminated in case you have COVID-19. Quite close to my heart. I used to be a seafarer myself many years ago. Then we go to the ports. We have a technical note here from the port management program, Train for Trade, which provides concrete good practices to protect port personnel while maintaining efficient port operations. We also need to look specifically at the trade in critical goods. There are several specific trade facilitation measures that are particularly useful to speed up clearance and release of critical goods. There's a long list. A lot of these have to do with digitalization. It's important that sanitary and health restrictions should not become a disguised barrier to trade. Then we go to the cross-border transport, trucks, trains, airplanes, and their transport workers. I think that's an important point. It's not so much about the trucks, it's about the truck drivers, not so much about the ship or the containers, the seafarers that pose a challenge to the logistics. So we need to find ways to allow them to cross borders, and then the landlocked countries and the transit countries need to maintain their access to seaports. We encourage and work with transit coordinators, for example, to encourage cooperation among transit countries and landlocked developing countries. All this, of course, is a lot of changed information, changed routes. So we also work with our trade information portals to keep them updated, so that in times of a rapidly changing trading environment, it is particularly important to communicate clearly and ensure information is available to all actors and stakeholders. All this, well, most of this has to do with to go paperless. As physical contact between people needs to be minimized, electronic submissions and paperless transactions become ever more important. Processes need to be dematerialized. We also need to address early on legal implications. Industry and traders need to be encouraged to waive some of their legal rights and agree on moratoria for payments, performance, and so on. Governments may provide financial backup where necessary. We also need to protect shippers from the service providers, but also the service providers from the shippers. Economic emergency and social protection measures need to include the logistics industry, the international trade logistics, among the priority beneficiaries. But also we want to ensure that the service providers, the carriers, do not impose undue fees, charges. It has to be transparent, like demurrage on charters and shippers. Well, having said all these, I said 10-point, well, 9-point program, and the 10th is a lot of this requires technical assistance. Many developing countries were already confronted with challenges before the COVID-19 crisis. And a lot of these require collaboration among countries, and a lot of what we do in UNCTAD actually targets all these specific measures where we collaborate with our members in a long range of programs, from customs automation to legal advice, to port management, to sustainable corridors, to port reform. And I'm sure I've forgotten quite a few, and the colleagues who are listening now will complain afterwards. Trade facilitation, empowerment program, trade information portals, all these work in this direction. One last message. When you see these types of presentations on trade facilitation, you often see a picture of a balance or a trade-off. And I think this really gives the wrong impression. Any specific measure we are proposing on advanced ruling, pre-arrival processing, single window, electronic payments, they really help to achieve both. They help to facilitate transport and trade, and they protect the population from COVID-19. One final sales pitch, or you will have this PowerPoint here, are links to further information about the work we do to help in this endeavor. Thank you very much. And I will do somewhere, click the stop share.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you very much. I think that was very enlightening. Now, we know that capacity building is an essential tool in these times, and we'll now have two panelists on capacity building for the blue economy in a post-COVID-19 scenario. Many of our panelists have addressed the need for capacity building on COVID scenario. And now we have first Rabib Hada, Director of the Multilateral Diplomacy Division of UNITAR, and then we'll have Honi Benham. Honorary President of the International Ocean Institute, IOI. So I start with Rabi. Rabi, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's such a pleasure to be with you and to be with the distinguished members of the panel from the United Nations and also from IOI. This is showing that the UN is extremely active and still full of life and energy during these difficult times. And also, I've been monitoring the chat. We have really brilliant people on board, a lot of resources for persons. So we look forward to exchanging with them, and thank you for being with us. I have prepared a presentation for you that is divided in 3 parts. The first part will allow us to set the stage, to reflect a little bit, and to take the blue economy and to insert it in the context of the global economic challenges that we are facing, just so that we are reminded on the global level of the huge challenges that we all face. The second part of my presentation actually is going to be a speech that I'm going to be reading. A good friend of mine is the ambassador of the Marshall Islands here in Geneva. Her name is Doreen de Broom, and she's right now in the Marshalls. I was texting her on WhatsApp a few days ago and informing her about this important conference. And she sees the opportunity actually to send me a text. And this text is going to be the story, basically, that will give life to all of the presentations that our colleagues shared right now. So it will add to the statistics. It will be a story of a country, basically, and the challenges they are facing right now in relation to COVID-19 and the other challenges. The third part of the presentation is going to be a quick presentation of the capacity building approach and activities that we have and how we are structured at UNITAR. So I'm going to go straight with the first one. So COVID-19 has disrupted the world economies, as we all know. And even before that, we saw that signs of weakness in the world economy and that the world economy was slowing down. Now, we witnessed the questioning, as you know, by some powerful countries of multilateral free trade agreements, and there were tough negotiations between these countries for the establishment of bilateral agreements. This is from one side. Now we are experiencing at the same time trade wars between 2 big giants, the United States and China. The EU is negotiating a post-Brexit deal with the UK. The price of the barrel of petrol, and in the presentations before, we saw that the shipments of oil and whatever are affected by COVID has gone down to $20 per barrel at one moment in time. The IMF declares that this is the first time since the Great Depression that both industrialized and also developing nations are going into recession. And it is projected that some OECD countries won't be able to overcome this COVID impact before a decade to come. Now, to come out of this scenario, industrialized nations, as we all know, are pouring trillions of dollars in stimulus packages. And the 2 big questions that we all deserve to ask here together is, first, how can we guarantee sustainability while overcoming COVID-19 in these stimulus packages and the investment of these stimulus packages? And 2 is the most important, who is going to help developing countries that were already facing a huge burden? For instance, as we all know, European leaders and people are pushing today for a green recovery plan. But what about the rest of the world? I think David mentioned it at one moment in time. Could there be a blue recovery plan? And what about the SIDS that are confronted to 10 times worse challenges, as highlighted in the statistics provided by Stefan and David in their presentations before? So this is the first part of my presentation, just complementing and giving a stratospheric view of what is happening. Now, in the second part, and we can move to the third slide, please. In the second part, I'm going to read the message, as I told you, from Ambassador Doreen, who is a source of inspiration. She is a genuine personality, and she projects a true image of a person who's fighting for the right cause. So her speech is as follows, and I promise you it's going to be fast. Outside of the COVID-19 issues and challenges we face today, we all must be reminded that in the Pacific, our homes and communities are scattered across the biggest ocean in the world. Our cultures and traditions are rich and unique, yet we are facing existential threat. This year has been apocalyptic for the Pacific, and climate change is the main culprit. And now, in addition, we have COVID-19. Because of the effects of climate change, our region has already started to feel like a war zone. People have died, homes have been destroyed, and economies left in ruins. But while our boat has been rocked, our resolve to weather the storm and turn the tide has grown stronger. While some like to dismiss us as a small island nations, we are in fact large ocean nations. And hence why I used it in the slide. It's a beautiful actually quote. The Pacific has worked hard and had made a big contribution to the formulation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And one big focus has been the blue economy, working together to secure our economic future through sustainable management of our resources, especially our fisheries. And while we have made progress out at sea, challenges grow onshore. Water and energy are the very building blocks of a successful life and economy in the Pacific Islands. Prolonged droughts are hitting some of our islands hard, and salt water is creeping into freshwater lenses in others, leaving many of us almost entirely reliant on rainfall, which is increasingly unpredictable due to climate change. Our response has been swift and impactful, from increasing the capacity of our water storage systems to installing solar water purifiers in our remote atolls. We have fortified ourselves from future water scarcity. But we also recognize that these new challenges call for rethinking our traditional way of life, which has meant replacing our crop varieties with ones that are more drought resistant. And I think this will be extremely useful for the FAO colleagues. We are clearly pushing ahead to bolster our resilience from every possible angle. On the energy side of things, the costs of imported fossil fuels continue to drain our public coffers and act as a serious drag on our development prospects. Through our NDCs, the Marshall Islands government embarked on a clean green mission to embrace the new low carbon future. We are currently in the midst of one of the most aggressive national decarbonization efforts in the world. We have solarized our outer atolls and taken steps to even improve our demand side efficiency in our major population centers. Every gallon of fossil fuel we no longer use is literally money in our pockets. This is the money that can go towards public health and education, issues all our islands are struggling with in this rapidly changing world. In many ways, the challenges we face are truly opportunities for our islands to build stronger and more resilient economies. And through forums like this, we have a chance to build and strengthen our economies and to steer the world to calmer waters. We must not be deterred by our size. After all, we are the largest ocean nations in the world. And she ended her speech with Komol Tata, which is thank you in her own language. Now, please, can we shift to the other slides? So this slide is a slide actually from the Marshall Islands, and I think somebody is fishing there. And please, can we move to the other slide? To this, okay. So UNITAR, the United Nations Institute for Training and Research, has been restructured. It was one of the first agencies of the United Nations to completely be restructured on the pillars of the SDGs. We are 100% aligned with the SDGs. Basically, we have a pillar on planet, a pillar on people, one on prosperity, and one on peace. And our division, the division of diplomacy, is a cross-cutting division that tries to bring all of these pillars together. So these are the thematic areas where we are operating nowadays, and you have them on the screen, and that are impactful and useful to take up the challenges of the blue economy. Now, the most important in what we do is how we do it. What we do is we partner with institutions of the United Nations, all the agencies that are right now here present in this platform, and we bring from them the knowledge.
I lost the.
Sorry. So we bring the knowledge of the United Nations colleagues and agencies, and from the professionals and the practitioners from the United Nations, and we share it with all the member states through adult learning and innovative training methodologies. So I'm going to cut it short because it can go on forever, but we look forward to engaging in discussions together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rabi. Now I pass the floor to Oni. Oni, please.
I have no visual of yourself and the panel, but I believe you hear me.
Yes.
So I have my presentation, which I'm going to read out to you now. I do not see any photos or anything like that, so it's just my own screen. Now, COVID-19 to me has been a wake-up call, because we had 3 lost decades in multilateral cooperation for development. We entered uncharted waters of consequential perfect storm, a storm arising from the converging challenges of global security, climate change, economic financial crisis. And added to this, the systemic erosion of rule-based trading system. Post-COVID-19 resilience and recovery for a vibrant blue economy will depend on different approach to multilateral development cooperation for trade and beyond trade. No longer viable multilateral cooperation that is based on we give nothing and we got nothing syndrome, which dominated multilateral cooperation for decades, nor is the aspirational philosophy of wait for it and the market will solve all problems. Hence, there is a valid reason to place and focus blue economy and blue growth in a new development perspective that's human-centered. After all, it's ingenuity of the human being that propels progress. The blue economy paradigm is an integrated approach to cross-cutting sectors in the governance of the ocean and urban interface, implying an inclusive partnership between all stakeholders that internalizes the conformity of the short-term needs with the long-term objectives of sustainable growth. An important tenet of the blue economy is that responsibility, as well as sharing in the costs and benefits, does not rest with any single entity or sector or the state, but it's spread among all stakeholders. It is the responsibility of all stakeholders in an integrated paradigm at the level of the individual, child, adult, locality, community, society, institution, national, regional, public, and private sectors. So post-COVID-19, the blue economy recovery and the blue growth, as any other productive economic, environmental, and social sector, will require corrective measures combined with adequate resources, both human and financial, to address challenges of adaptation and mitigations and navigate safely the perfect storm. We have heard about all the challenges in the sectors of fisheries, shipping, etc. There is no denying that the pandemic has negatively impacted all industries, marine-related, trade services, tourism, business, financial institutions. However, post-COVID-19 blue economy will require considerable financial resources for recovery, resilience, and adaptation. Here, we must rekindle the long controversial debate as who should pay when the case is that of benefiting from free access to resources and services of the ocean. The issue that goes beyond the consequences of the pandemic and in the context of healthy multilateral cooperation for development and sustainability, the very reason of the blue economy. In this case, we need to examine who benefits from free access to ocean living and non-living resources, and yet do not make in return a contribution commensurate with the privilege. For example, compensation could be in the form of notional levy that goes towards supporting developing countries and SIDS who invest in the blue economy future. I submit as a policy of reason that if a farmer pays rent for land that he cultivates, why do industrial fishing fleets and fishing consortia do not pay in return a notional levy for their free access to ocean living resources? Why do road transporters pay tolls, but shipping companies pay nothing for the free navigation of their ships in maritime transport, considering the amount of pollution shipping contributes to the environment? This concept equally applies to pharmaceutical companies, oil and gas extractive companies, and other benefiting from free access to ocean living and non-living resources. Cosmetic companies and those producers of plastic products and packaging, which results in microplastic entering the food chain, an existential danger for human health. Also consider those who dispose of toxins and land-based pollution, stressing the ocean living resources, and could, in theory, provoke new pathogens emerging in the future. A similar levy for blue services, not unlike the Tobin tax on financial transaction in blue services, could be added to the list, consequently activating not only the polluter pays principle, but also user pay principle. If this is too radical, which in my opinion is not, then blue bonds as means of financing blue growth should be additionally considered in post-COVID-19. New multilateral cooperation agenda as a contribution to meet capacity building needs of developing countries in transition, and institutionalize the blue economy concept. However, these must be managed differently to the green carbon trading permits, which eventually resulted in a permit to pollute. Having said that, I hope to raise two issues. The first is the unsung heroes of the blue economy, seafarers and fishers, who are on the front line of the global calamity. About 1.3 million are distant and semi-distant water fishers, mostly migrant workers, toiling in dangerous conditions, providing 30% of protein to the less privileged people in developing countries and developed. Professor Alistair Cooper et al. Documented seafarers fishers' plight in his book, Fishers and Plunderers. I don't know whether you see me or not. These fishers spent several years at sea under inhumane conditions and modern-day slavery of unpaid wages, lack of adequate food, water, sanitation, no medical care, excessive working hours, extended periods at sea, verbal and physical abuse, human trafficking and abandonment, even murder. Today, COVID-19 made these seafarers even less visible. There are various international conventions, IMO, ILO, and many other international instruments on the rights and duties of and conditions of service. Also, UNCLOS addresses the right of people working at sea. However, sadly, the surveillance, implementation, and enforcement mechanism fall far too short from providing adequate safety net for the seafarers. Addressing this situation requires regional, international, multilateral cooperation, particularly in enforcement of the genuine link between vessel and the flag state, as mandated by UNCLOS and defined by the UNCTAD UN Convention on Registration of Ships awaiting to be ratified since 1986. This brings me to the third issue I wish to raise, the people factor and consideration of people in growing sustainable blue economy and the concept of capacity development. We have seen the evolution of the concept of development from technical assistance to capacity building. However, capacity development can only be achieved if it includes transfer of technology. In the absence of multilaterally agreed code of conduct for effective transfer of technology, there is a need to resort to a different tool to sustain the blue economy and blue growth recovery that is adequate to fill the need for empowered, skilled human resources in all ocean and coastal disciplines. Hence, the focus must be on human resource development of knowledgeable, empowered practitioners with technological and management capabilities that operate in all different interdependent marine and coastal sectors of the blue economy. They are all interdependent. You cannot treat fisheries from maritime, from the community, from the coastal, from tourism. An idea that I shared with Professor Philip Wilson of Southampton University as part of the solution is the creation of support blue economy career centers, where the concept of the blue economy has been institutionalized to prepare a variety of human resources required from the general knowledge and advocacy to the professional skilled practitioners needed to fuel the blue growth. Such centers may be limited or of wide scope coverage to serve both as a learning institutions, research training, education with international and regional cooperation, and collaboration in public-private partnership. This is what IOI since inception has been devoted its effort to capacity development and governance. And it is our conviction the human factor is the ultimate tool in resilience and recovery. Thank you. Hello?
Yes.
You heard me?
Yes.
Because I don't see anything on the screen.
We heard you very well, Rony. Thank you very much. Very good ideas and a very challenging presentation. Now, before we open the floor for the last set of questions and for discussion, we'll have closing remarks on COVID-19 considerations for ocean governance and the blue economy by François Baillet, Senior Legal Officer, Head of Capacity Building and Trust Funds, UN Ola Doualos. François.
Thank you very much, Excellency, and bear with me as I start to share my screen. Okay. Do you see my screen?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Thanks again, Your Excellency, and thank you, UNCTAD, Mrs. Coke-Hamilton, of course, and colleagues for organizing this with FAO and our dear friends at IOI. This is a pleasure for us to participate in this important workshop, and we're very pleased to be able to contribute a few words in closing. Some key points that have been raised at a very high level today by the speakers in the different sectors demonstrate that it's very, very clear what we're living now has strong impact on, obviously, tourism, fisheries, shipping, and as Dr. Benham just mentioned, the interrelationship between all of these, of course, is very present. The cross-cutting issues is SIDS, of course, and LDCs, and this cannot be emphasized enough. Vulnerable segments of society have been underlined, and this is something that needs to be central to our thinking, as well as, of course, vulnerable personnel, and the plight of the seafarers is something we should not forget and must remain at the forefront of our multilateral and national efforts. And of course, capacity is so fundamental. I often say, raise your hand if you don't believe in education. And in this regard, I'd like to raise, not my hand, but that one of our capacity building programs that's undertaken in partnership with the Nippon Foundation, the United Nations Nippon Foundation Fellowship Program, the alumni from some 80 countries around the world have convened several times around COVID and ocean affairs to discuss and understand at the national, regional, and international levels what are impacts and lessons learned. And I think this will be made available very soon on the Doualos website. So I add that as a resource to further inform these ongoing discussions. The critical point also raised, and I think this is the leitmotif throughout, is SDG implementation, and as Pamela mentioned, Target 7. And this is where I come in and add that really this requires governance, good governance and ocean governance. some of the sectors in picture for the general public that's watching us, and you'll recognize these slides from the Blue Economy Conference held in Kenya, sorry. We have, of course, an enormous economic sector, both in terms of livelihood and in terms of food security coming out of the ocean in the form of seafood or fish that we eat, shellfish, etc., seafood as a whole. Of course, this is being challenged tremendously during the pandemic period, and we've heard details about this. Shipping, I won't stop on this one. We've heard some very important information, and I again underline the importance of seafarers and marine-based personnel of all sorts. One of the ones that I'd like to underline as well, which is an impact on the ocean, and also part of the blue economy, is the plastics and just the land-based sources of pollution. We're seeing during the pandemic an enormous rise in land-based sources of pollution. Particularly, the symbolic one is, of course, the masks and gloves that everybody is using around the world that are ending up in the ocean. But a lot of the other land-based sources of pollution, like many other criminal activities, are not really being controlled as effectively as one would hope. And so the downside is that all of the blue technologies that are being developed are really not even looked at as we try and adapt to the pandemic, and we lose ground on that. Of course, I don't have time to unpack ocean governance as a theory. We would be here for many days. And there is no real comprehensive definition of ocean governance, I'm quick to point out. But in understanding how we govern the oceans, and we collectively, I want to just dive in a few minutes on some of these key categories which constitute the governance framework. We have obviously the political and diplomatic aspects of governance, and we have the legal and policy aspects. Of course, we operationalize through institutions, and then we do this at all the various levels, from the local community all the way to the multilateral global. And in doing so, we of course have these cross-cutting issues that we consider, and increasingly since Agenda 21, we've been incorporating into our national and international and regional policies, those of integration and ecosystem-based science, et cetera, et cetera. We quickly look at the pandemic's effects, and this is really cursory, on the diplomatic, legal, and policy framework. Well, of course, as an international civil servant, I can say the diplomatic processes around ocean affairs and law of the sea are moving on, but are greatly challenged. We have the stall of the negotiations around some of the ocean-based legal frameworks, the BBNJ, as is commonly known, that have stalled. Obviously, at a national and regional level, law and policy making have been challenged, if not halted completely, only to convene maybe for emergency measures such as ensuring ports remain open, et cetera, et cetera. Voting, elections, not only within the context of the ocean governance framework, but also just within a national context, are tremendously challenged in this pandemic. On the institutional side, we're observing some interesting challenges and opportunities. I don't think I need to explain how challenging it is for institutions to effectively manage their programs of work during this period. The coordination, of course, is tremendously difficult, and managing ocean spaces, resources, and activities obviously adds that extra dimension of space that makes it even more difficult. We've heard a little bit about MCS and challenges within IUU, and I can confirm that through our consultations and our various programs, anecdotally, we are seeing crime rise in proportion to non-criminal activity, shall we say. Again, anecdotal. We'll have to see overall how the statistics balance over the next months and years. The positive is we're seeing a lot of interdepartmental collaboration emerge. Necessity breeds this, I think, as we come together and we realize that perhaps it's more effective to work together to address not only these pandemics, but realizing slowly in doing so that we are more effective working together and collaborating. And interestingly, we're seeing a lot of public-private partnerships around security, and I mean security in the broadest of senses, from environmental security to human security in the ocean, being formed. Again, these are anecdotal, but in our projects and programs, we're also feeling it, and it's definitely coming at the forefront. I mentioned briefly again the challenges in the governance system at the participatory integration, ecosystem approaches, and the science policy interface are all tremendously important. Science at sea has stopped effectively, and we are tremendously challenged by this, and the science policy interface that we've made so many gains on will be harmed unless we are able to start to ramp up again quickly. Of course, the challenges between the collaboration at all levels is difficult in a time when collaboration and communication are difficult. Without wanting to unpack this any further, and I know there are many of our alumni watching this seminar, you're all laughing, I assume, at this slide, which you've seen too many times, I'll say. I want to dive into the far side where it says blue capital and blue economy for a few minutes. But just to remind you that all of these elements of the ocean governance framework are being challenged and must be specifically addressed if we're not to lose the gains in sustainability and livelihood that the oceans have given us over the last few decades. There are opportunities, and I want to just briefly mention, it was mentioned by a colleague earlier, that good governance actually does yield significant dividends, and it's now not a time to forget that. Some studies have shown this empirically, and you can read the statistics for yourself. So again, good governance does yield positive dividends, both ecological, social, and economic, and now is not the time to let go. Another thing to really consider carefully is as we rebuild, we have to pay particular attention to livelihoods and economy. And sometimes they're not directly linked, as I think Dr. Benham was underlining. If we look at some statistics, a little dated 2010, but I think still would proportionally hold today, the largest blue economy employer is industrial capture fisheries. However, it constitutes only 1% of the blue economy. We've heard a lot about marine and coastal tourism being critical to SIDS and many coastal developing and developed nations. And we see here all of a sudden that there is a much stronger link and correlation between high employment and high contribution to the blue economy. So as we rebuild, these sectors need to be looked at carefully. And of course, I recognize there's interlinkages between the sectors, but this is just a very quick snapshot to warn that sometimes we need to put a little bit more effort in something and not the thing that we thought. Also, as was mentioned by several speakers, we're observing new visions in supply and value chains, and the message from the Pacific Islands was very clear on this. We're seeing that individuals and stakeholders who are resource say conscious and who actually have the ability to manage immediate natural resources in their surroundings are shortening the value chains out of necessity, but realizing also that for their own resilience, this is a long-term strategy that may pay significant dividends. So if we relink this to ocean governance, what does it mean? Well, it means that we definitely need to rethink who is at the table and how ocean governance is structured. From an economics perspective, we can look at this, which many of you will know as a famous diagram that was created by Michael Porter. And if we adapt it to the ocean governance context, we really clearly see that the role of the private sector, the role of the citizens, the communities, the non-corporates is going to increase within the stewardship of the ocean resources. And this has been very clear in the traditional societies of the globe for many years, but has been lost in many cases because of industrialization and rapid economic growth. So as we go through this pandemic and we hear from the lessons learned, such as those that were shared with us today, it's important to understand how this can be incorporated into the governance systems in the longer term, both to build in resilience, but also livelihoods. Finance was mentioned quickly, and I'll mention it as well because I think it's fundamental to how we move forward. The major question is, will the traditional sources of finance or capital be available? Yes, perhaps lessened. But more importantly, I think we need to look at new ways of funding the blue economy and ensuring livelihoods. And here I really draw your attention to the need to have blended approaches where we have strong coordination around various types of capital that have different objectives on return and risk, from the philanthropy or the pure gifting through to impact and all the way into markets. These are not mutually exclusive and must cohabitate to and exist as a package if we are to lift ourselves not only out of the pandemic, but face some of the other challenges that were mentioned. And finally, I leave you with some of these points of just quick reflection. We need better governance. It's clear we have higher returns when we have better governance, and returns of all types, social, economic, and of course, environmental. But how do we stabilize the governance systems in a pandemic and ensure that we have the lessons learned to carry through once we've recovered? We saw an increased mention of the blue economy and ocean policies and even national development strategies, but not how it is to be implemented. We are working on this. And again, we want to stay the course as we emerge from the as we emerge from the pandemic and ensure that we truly are blue as we build looking forward. And as I mentioned, the last 2 points I'll put in one, and that is that we need to ensure that there is effective stakeholder participation in the governance, and we need to ensure that capital and the social license to operate are actually blue and incorporated in the governance framework. I argue that all of this is really applicable to building a better long-term ocean governance framework. And with that, I thank you. And I also point out that June 8th is World Oceans Day. This is one of the first events in celebration of World Oceans Day. And please join the UN system and all of the international community on Monday, June 8th to celebrate World Oceans Day. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Francois. I think as you've seen, we're going slightly above our time, but this is just, it just shows the interest that we have. I think we peaked at more than 300 people online, and we've had never below 200. I think we'll now make a short break of just a couple of minutes to take some questions, and then we'll go back to you. Maybe we can extend these maybe to 5:20, if that's fine with my fellow panelists. So we'll make a very short break now, a couple of minutes, and then we'll go back to you with 4 or 5 more questions. Thank you very much.
Amanda? Pam? Pam, do you hear me?
Yes, Ani.
Yeah, you know, on what you said was very important. To have the Caribbean islands going further and further into a blue economy zone. It is not incompatible with the law of the sea.
Right.
In fact, the law of the sea encourages that kind of cooperation.
Yeah.
And it would lead also to economies of scale. That's how blue economy becomes stronger. And therefore, there is no reason. This is not zoning in terms of sovereignties and rights of that. No, this is economic, social, and environmental cooperation you end up. So it's a great idea to go from just one island to the whole archipelago to do that.
Is the chair there? I may have to leave because I have a 6 o'clock that I have to go to and I have to drive.
Okay, all right. So, but I think we already have a few questions.
Okay.
So I think I'll start the questions in 2 minutes.
Okay.
And then, do we have one specific for you?
No,
Pamela? Okay, no, Pamela. So I don't think we have one specific for you. If you can wait just 2 minutes,
Sure.
I'll start. I'll give the questions and thank you, and say that you need to leave.
No problem.
Okay, in 2 minutes.
Precisam dizer alguma coisa, não é?
Okay. So I think we will now take maybe 4 questions. Before I start the questions, I want to very much thank Pamela that will have to leave us because she has another appointment, but I didn't want her to leave without my thanking her for your contribution and for all your help in organizing these. So thank you very much, Pamela.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And let me just also thank Doulas for working with us on the OECS program. I just wanted to recognize them very much. Thank you for that. And thank you for marshalling this panel, Mr. Chairman. I think this is a key issue that I believe we need to work on even more so now than before. It's a great opportunity, particularly for coastal countries. So I look forward to working with you again. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Pamela. Good. And so now I think we'll take about 4 questions. The first is from Rodrigo Akohu, and I think it's addressed to Jan Hoffman. How should governments in coastal states react to the disruptive effects of the COVID-19 on ports' economic performance? Jan, if you want to answer this one.
Yeah, I mean, overall, the whole point of this policy brief that I presented was to see how should governments react. Some of this has to do with collaboration. If there's one thing I would like to highlight, it's the need to also collaborate, not to be a free rider, not just say, okay, let me close down. We have seen countries which let in trucks that were in transit, and then it was not let into the next neighboring country. So it was stuck in the transit country. So there's a lot of need for collaboration. Otherwise, yeah, if I start detailing, I'd be happy to engage. I think my email is on the PowerPoint to provide more details. But have the one answer to what should governments do is probably a bit would be beyond the time we have for this very interesting panel.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. I have now.
And I did respond to 2 or 3 questions already in the chat. So
yeah, okay.
Questions I responded in writing, and as I said, happy to engage bilaterally.
Very good. That's something to be encouraged. Thank you very much. Now the second question would be for François Baillet from IOI Nigeria, Mabel Waheri, and Rodrigo Akohu. And the question is, much has been said about the blue economy since the Ocean Conference in New York. What is the current UN policy for nations in implementation of marine spatial planning, either nationally or at transboundary level? How do you estimate this pandemic will affect environmental sustainability policies, especially marine protected areas, considering existing challenges in food security in sub-Saharan Africa? François. Yes.
You can always count on our alumni to push us. So we're going to solve the problems of the world in 3 sentences. Listen, it's basically my presentation, I think, speaks to the question as a whole. The leitmotifs in there are effective governance. Obviously, marine spatial planning and all the tools that we use to manage sustainably ocean spaces, resources, and activities are tremendously challenged at this time. And we need to keep an eye on that so that, as I mentioned, we don't slip and lose gains. Having said that, I think the United Nations Ocean Conference has created a lot of momentum, and we see with the postponement of this conference that was to be held this year, there is an enormous amount of interest and mobilization around oceans nonetheless, and we're looking forward to the next conference. So that has to be captured and not lost. And I think that various organizations and programs are doing a really good job, including in some of the places mentioned in the question, at trying to maintain this momentum and helping. And as far as capacity goes, which is a fundamental element of all of this, I know that our office is continuing its programs and continuing to build on the lessons learned, including those, as I mentioned, through this pandemic. So I hope that answers some of the questions. Otherwise, I know Rodrigue and friends at IOI know where I live.
Okay, thank you, Francois. Now I have another question, maybe to Ravi or David, from Mahesh Sugutan. And it is, to what extent have governments announced measures to provide relief to vulnerable populations in the blue economy, especially in developing countries? Could a part of multilateral aid packages that have been announced be channeled towards this end as well?
Yes,
Thank you, Chair. I think this is more David. David, go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, and Ravi and others can complement. Yes, very good question. On existing measures by developing countries, there are not so many. Most of the support provided in developing countries that we are aware of is related to sustain vulnerable populations, including fisheries, coastal populations, in the form of income support right now. So in form of providing food to, again, poor populations, etc. So it has gone very directly to social concerns at this stage, not to a wider range. Many of them are thinking of supporting the tourism sector and also others that are in deep trouble, but not yet consolidated. In Europe, there are some responses on the fisheries sectors, but also on blue sectors. Globally, we don't have yet a package to support developing countries and vulnerable seats. That's a call that needs to be made. How we build that recovery package, how we finance it, how we distribute it, etc. And it's urgently needed because the effects of this pandemic may not only last by 2020, but can go for 2021 and longer if we don't find a vaccine. So word of caution. Ravi may complement.
Thank you, David.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, David. Nothing from my side. I think David covered it all. Thank you.
Okay. So now I have maybe a final question from Ole Louis, infrastructure advisor at the Swedish Maritime Administration, and Ramazan Achikos, and it's for Oni and for Jan. And the question is, when we consider the aspect of fishers and crews on ships, we see the difficulties faced on commercial large-scale fisheries and also other crews which were unable to return home. One should also take into account the seafarers stuck at home and that they lost their income. How can we cope with these issues which are important for maritime safety and the blue economy? Do you want to answer this, Oni or Jan, or both?
Or Oni starts.
You know how I feel about it. This is happening because we don't have the right governance structure to protect seafarers. The seafarers are mainly migrants and people from developing countries who are looking. So they get an agent who recruits them in X country in Asia on a vessel that has a company. Once the vessel goes away, the flag changes, the owner changes, and the recruiter disappears. So now you have a human being afloat that cannot go back to his country, has no papers, and he's now enslaved. And the truth is, what we have is we have laws and regulations, but these are not sufficient in terms of implementation, in terms of the protection needed for, and that goes back to an original sin. And I know how he will, Huffman will, the original sin is the law of the sea states there must be a genuine link between, mandated a genuine link between a ship and the flag state, so that the flag state can be responsible to the seafarers. That has never been, it was mandated but never been applied. So you always have this criminality going on, this theft is going on, the illegal fishing going on, but most of that is done on the backs of these poor seafarers who have no protection whatsoever. Imagine if you're from Myanmar and you get dumped in Bangladesh or you get dumped in Thailand and you have no money, no papers, there's no way that you can get home or you can survive. So the original sin, that's why I mentioned that there is a convention. There's a convention that was adopted, which says that genuine link has to be made in terms of responsibility of the flag state by having either ownership, management, finance, or the labor, whereby then you can hold the flag state to its responsibility. And what has been discovered now is basically mafiosa type of fisheries you have. And you say we have laws, we have not, but laws are good on paper. Who is implementing? Who is enforcing? No one. So we have to go back to deal with the original sin.
Well, thank you very much, Oli. That's an answer, Jan.
Yes, and only, of course, he knows this best. He is among the fathers of what then, he could not prevent from becoming the original sin. And it's true, there are several disconnects. There's the one between the flag and the country of ownership, and our UNCTAD data shows that today more than 70% of the world tonnage, the nationality of the owner is different from the nationality of the flag. And the few, like the 30 or less than 30% where it is still the same, it is mostly due to some restrictions, for example, cabotage trades or some subsidies or some other reasons. So the standard practice is that there's a disconnect, and it is legal that a government of a country, and I won't name names here, but all the flag states, the open registries, they decide a genuine link for me is that the company has a post box in my country. Yeah, that's so that each country decides what is a genuine link, and that is unfortunate that it results. The second disconnect is that increasingly seafarers are employed by crewing agencies like time workers who are then leased, so to say, to the place where they actually work on the ship. Now, these two disconnects do not always work badly. It's a system that does work. There are international regulations. So the global implementation of the rules, the ILO 2006 Maritime Convention or the IMO conventions, like the average global implementation is like the average of all the countries, rich and poor, small, big, developed, landlocked, coastal. So we have one system, this is not as good as it would be if it were all one highly developed conscientious country, but it's also not as bad as if it were just one very corrupt, small, not functioning, failed state. So in between we have the system. And now there's also another difference, not a disconnect. For the cargo carrying ships, generally the internationally trading, the situation is not quite as bad as for many fishing ships. There are many overlaps. It's a Gauss distribution. Because for the cargo carrying ships, yeah, also there the crewing is not such a high share of the actual cost, and they go to port states. So there's a port state control that would not allow you and would not release the ship. There's inspection, and this happens more on the cargo carrying ships or cruise ships also that go to the ports than on the fishing vessels who may stay weeks, months, years on the ocean, where you have de facto situations of slavery. So it's very, very complex, fascinating. We try to analyze this in our review of maritime transport, and we could go on and on it. I have had this conversation quite often.
All right, Jan. Well, thank you very much, Jan. I think this has been a very interesting conference. I think we need to close. We've overshot our time. I'd very much like to thank all the panelists and all the participants, of which there were many, as I told you, for their very insightful thoughts and discussions. A particular thanks, of course, to the organizers, UNCTAD, FAO, UNITAR, and IOI for the timely response. And not only on the substance, but also on the technical organization of the event. In closing, I would like to invite all participants to participate and engage on the 2020 Oceans Conference once a new date is defined. The conference is, as I said, co-convened by Kenya in Portugal, and it will be of utmost importance in reorienting ocean action from SDG 14 implementation in a totally different world that we hope will be more open, sustainable, and solidarity. I hope that you have a nice evening and a very happy World Oceans Day celebration. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. Congrats to all.